Obstacle course. We all set? Okay, thank you for being here today. We're here today to announce that earlier this morning, Rochester City Councilman Adam C. McFadden pled guilty before United States District Judge Elizabeth Wolford to a 2-count information. That information charged Mr. McFadden with committing wire fraud and with filing a false tax return. Based upon his pleas of guilty to those offenses, he faces a maximum possible term of imprisonment of 20 years. As we just heard in court, the scheme to defraud alleged in the wire fraud count essentially involves Mr. McFadden's efforts to obtain from Rochester Housing Charities approximately $87,500 in a contract that was entered into between RHC, Rochester Housing Charities, and a Washington, D.C. firm identified as CCP, Capital Connection Partners, a limited liability corporation down in D.C. And pursuant to the scheme devised here, Mr. McFadden entered into a pass-through contract with CCP whereby he would obtain 75% of the proceeds of the monies paid under that $87,500 contract between Rochester Housing Charities and CCP. 75% of that funds would be paid to Mr. McFadden. And during the course of the scheme, which basically extended from about May of 2015 through late December of 2015, it was, as admitted to in court today by Mr. McFadden, he filed various false inserts, if you will, for invoices for work that he allegedly performed, or CCP allegedly performed, under the contract with RHC. And as we heard in court today, the inserts contained information which was either false or grossly exaggerated the nature and amount of work done by Mr. McFadden. So today's plea, as a result of that, he obtained approximately $65,000, a little over $65,000 fraudulently through his contract. And further, it's alleged and is admitted to today, pursuant to his plea of guilty, Mr. McFadden filed false tax returns. Particularly, he pled guilty to filing a false tax return in 2015, which contained false deductions and false expenses. And as a result, the IRS suffered a tax loss of approximately $46,865. I think today's plea of guilty is a victory for the taxpayers of Monroe County and the United States of America. His interests ahead of those of the taxpayers of Monroe County. And that will not be tolerated. My office will continue to seek out and bring to justice those public officials who elevate their own self-interest above that of the public. As I said, I think it's a victory for taxpayers and honest government, and I'd like to commend the tremendous work done by, first of all, to my right, Assistant United States Attorney Rick Resnick, Chief of our White Collar and General Crime Section here in Rochester. Rick handled the case and did an absolutely tremendous job, and he'll continue to handle this case and related matters moving forward. And then I'm also joined today by the Supervisory Special Agent from the FBI here in Rochester, Jeremy Bell. And Jeremy's going to say a few words, but before I do that, I also want to acknowledge the tremendous work done by the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, as well as by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Office of Inspector General. They also helped in this case. So without further ado, I'll let you hear from Mr. Bell.
Thanks, JP. I'll keep my remarks short. Today's guilty plea is the culmination of a lot of hard work by the FBI, HUD, IRS, and the United States Attorney's Office. But the plea doesn't mean that work is done. The FBI and our partners remain committed to rooting out public corruption in Rochester and throughout the Western New York community. I just ask public officials everywhere to think twice before abusing the community's trust. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. So with that, if there's any questions?
Yeah, this contract, just to be clear, it was for a housing development or?
It was for services to be provided on behalf of, for Rochester Housing Charities, RHC, by CCP, Capital Connection Partners. And essentially, I mean, it was to provide different services, basically, for entities, public entities that interface with the federal government. That was the belief of the services that would be provided. In fact, however, as we heard in court, the actual services which were provided were much less than those promised.
I'm sorry to drill into this, but like what service? Can you give me an example of like what kind of service was promised?
Well, in terms of, I can tell you what Mr. McFadden admitted he promised and didn't do, and those included things like preparing grant requests for local funding. They included conducting certain research, particularly for a laundry business development. He indicated that he had researched summer and after-school programs that for school-aged children that no services were provided under that. He claimed that he provided administrative support to the Rochester Housing Charities. That didn't happen. And he also claimed that he created a partnership with the Roberts companies to manage sell, lease, buyout negotiations. And as he indicated in court, that was grossly exaggerated.
This turnaround happened pretty quickly. We were just here it seems like a couple weeks ago talking about the case against him, and we were just in the discovery phase of that. Had you handed that over and that is what generated this? I mean, we haven't seen the plea agreement verbatim yet, but are there any other considerations here? It seems to have happened very quickly.
Well, I think because of the tremendous work done by our investigative partners and by the prosecutor assigned to this case, we had our ducks in a row when we charged the case. And as a result, we provided discovery quickly in the case. And as a result of that discovery, as we heard in court today, Mr. McFadden made a choice that it was in his best interest to plead guilty. So I think it's because the FBI, the IRS, and HUD, under working with Mr. Resnick, had done such a tremendous job sort of putting the case together that he really didn't view it as he had a lot of options here. Yes, Mr. Craig.
Two sort of disparate questions. One, is it proper or normal for CCP to act as they did as a pass-through here? And two, can you explain the cell tower thing a little more?
I'll defer those questions to Mr. Resnick.
With respect to the pass-through, the pass-through was basically a contract that was concealed. And the Roberts companies, there was a proposal submitted, but it was something that's commonly submitted to municipalities throughout the country, and the Rochester Housing Authority would get many of those solicited to them. So, again, it was grossly exaggerated. That's our
Just backing up to the first point then.
Yes.
We're hearing the plea from afar, obviously. But the CCP pass-through arrangement, was that something that was said in the plea that George Moses was aware of?
yes, plea agreement does say that.
And so that, still, that's a plea that, as you said, is something that's, not plea, I'm sorry, that's an agreement that's being concealed, so George Moses would have known of that, correct?
The plea agreement says that Mr. Moses got a copy of it.
I think even Mr. McFadden said in court that he advised Mr. Moses of the pass-through agreement.
Can you update us on the status of the George Moses case?
No, again, I'll defer to, it's ongoing. I mean, it's just pending. That's all we can really say at this point.
Is there any kind of, are you going to make any kind of a sentencing recommendation to Mr. McFadden?
Again, sentencing is scheduled for June. We'll abide that event at this point.
The tax return situation, I don't remember that in the first discussions about this. Was that something, is that tied to, or was one tied to the other, or is this completely separate? Because you mentioned something about rent, not claiming rent, but that wouldn't have been tied to this money, right?
Well, it certainly, I mean, it was tied together in the sense that he had income that was received that was not appropriately accounted for in his tax return. So that's not unusual that there will be a substantive underlying crime where sort of in the background we've been working with the IRS to look at potential tax charges associated with the financial crime alleged. So really not unusual, but today he pled guilty to both of those crimes.
So
Yes.
he didn't claim the money, though, that the profits that he was gaining from this contract, he didn't claim in taxes?
No, that's not accurate. The plea agreement provides that he deducted expenses from the income he reported, expenses that he should not have deducted because they were personal in nature, which then reduced his taxable income.
Just a question on the taxable income part. The loss that he admitted to, was that just for the 2015 year that he pleaded guilty, or is that for the 3 years that are part of it?
He pleaded guilty to one count involving 2015, but pursuant to his plea agreement, his relevant conduct, and that's how the penalty is determined under the sentencing guidelines, is based upon the aggregate amount of tax loss. It included all 3 years, 2015, 16, and 17.
Why just the one count?
Because it really essentially it has no impact to the extent it's going to be taken into consideration by the court at the time of sentencing. There was no reason to make him plead to each year. It really didn't add anything to the prosecution at all.
Does the plea agreement require his cooperation either in the George Moses case or in any other ongoing criminal investigations you have?
There's no discussion of that in court today, none.
So whether or not it was in court, is there one?
I'm bound by the information was set forth in the plea agreement, the publicly filed plea agreement, and what you heard in court today.
Is there any indication that George Moses might take a plea agreement?
Again, the case is pending.
Do you expect more charges within the case or related to the case?
Again, as Mr. Bell said, we're going to continue. We remain committed to rooting out public corruption wherever we find it in the community, and we're going to continue to look at this and all other public officials and ensure that they abide by the trust placed in them by the community. And if they don't, we're going to prosecute them.
But it's specific to this then, when you said that, because it sounded kind of general.
It is a general. It's what we do every day. And as far as this, I really have nothing to add to than what we've already said. Yes.
Could you just touch on the maximums for each charge?
20 years on the wire fraud and/or a $250,000 fine. The tax violation is a 3-year felony, I believe, and/or a $250,000 fine. Yes.
Returning to tax fraud or the misreporting, explain the rent. What actually was he saying that he was renting and wasn't renting, that he was deducting?
Yeah, well, can't get into the details. The plea agreement provides that he claimed he was paying rent for his business when he wasn't. I don't want to get into the details of what he claimed, who the landlord was or where the property was, but he claimed a false deduction for rent, among other false deductions, which lowered his taxable income.
That was for his company, Caesar?
Yes.
And was this a tax filing on behalf of Caesar, or was that a personal tax?
It was a Schedule C, which means that it was a personal tax return. He pled guilty to filing a personal tax return.
Can I ask you a quick question? I know I just walked in, so, but what's next in regards to anybody else being implicated here? I know that
We can't answer that question. You're late. No, I'm only kidding. It was a
I know
joke.
Mr. Moses' name came up in court.
Yes. The case against Mr. Moses remains pending. As to potential charges against anyone else, as I just gave a general answer indicating that we're continuing to examine. We look at the conduct of all public officials, and if there's any, if we detect any federal crimes have been committed, we will pursue charges against them.
So there is a possibility of charges with other people, or?
There's nothing. I mean, there's nothing imminent that I will say as a result of this case right now, but our investigation continues. That's it. Thank you.
You guys.
Thank you.